In the autumn of 1887, people across the ridge country north of Duluth, Minnesota, watched a young man do something that made no sense. Daniel Havorson had just inherited his grandfather's homestead, and the first thing he refused to do was tear off the roof. The cabin sat low against the earth at the edge of a spruce clearing, its walls hewn from squared pine, its chimney patched with river clay. What drew every eye, though, was what covered the top of the structure. 16 inches of packed turf, laced with moss and layered over sheets of birch bark, held together by living grass roots that had grown into one another for nearly 40 years. From a distance, the cabin looked less like a house than a hill someone had forgotten to level. Daniel was 28 and freshly returned from working the copper mines near Calumet. He had come home to bury his grandfather Samuel and had stayed to keep the homestead. Within a week of his arrival, the neighbors began appearing along the wagon road. Most of them were recent arrivals themselves, families who had come north on the promise of cheap land and cleared plots along the surveyor's lines. Their houses were tall frame structures with milled clapboard siding, cedar shingles, and glass windows shipped up from St. Paul. They were proud of those houses, and they were embarrassed by his. The first to speak plainly was Peter Gunderson, a lumber agent who lived a mile down the road. He rode over one October afternoon, dismounted without being invited, and studied the sod roof the way a man studies a thing that offends him. "You're living like an immigrant peasant, Daniel," he said. "That old man was stubborn, but he's gone now. Let us help you strip it. I can have shingles here by the end of the week at cost." Daniel thanked him for the offer and declined. Peter left without saying goodbye. The word spread quickly. In frontier country, a young man's decisions became public property the moment he made them. By the following Sunday, the congregation at the small Lutheran church had a name for the cabin. Some called it the Dirt House. Others called it Samuel's Mound. A few of the older Norwegian settlers who remembered the old country said nothing at all, and their silence carried a weight that Daniel noticed but could not yet name. His fiancée, Rebecca Lund, noticed it too. She was the daughter of a prosperous grain merchant in the nearest town, a bright young woman with an interest in the newer things, sewing machines, mail-order catalogs, the plans for a proper parlor in the house they were meant to share. She had accepted Daniel's proposal in the spring, back when he was still working the mines and speaking of building fresh when he came home. The sod roof had not been part of the picture she had drawn in her head. When she visited the homestead in mid-October, she stood in the yard for a long time before she spoke. "You could have shingles by winter," she said. Peter offered. "I know." "Then why?" Daniel looked up at the roof. A patch of late clover still bloomed near the ridge. He answered honestly, but the answer he gave was not the one she wanted to hear. 2 weeks later, she returned the ring. And by the first snowfall, Daniel Havorson was alone in a cabin the whole valley considered a joke. The break with Rebecca did not become a public argument. It became something quieter and in some ways harder to bear. Word simply traveled the way word always traveled in a small settlement. Within a few days, the men at the sawmill knew. Within a week, the women at the general store in Larson's Crossing knew. By the time the first hard frost arrived at the end of October, everyone within 20 miles had heard some version of the story. The young Havorson boy had chosen a pile of dirt over a decent woman. That was how Peter Gunderson put it. Others were less blunt, but the shape of the judgment was the same. Daniel worked through the talk the way his grandfather had taught him to work through weather. He kept his hands busy. He split firewood until his arms ached, then split more. He hauled stones from the creek bed and repaired a low spot in the foundation. He checked the sod roof carefully, running his palms along the seams where the birch bark met the eaves, pressing down on soft patches to test for rot. In 4 decades of Minnesota winters, the roof had lost only 2 square feet of turf. Samuel had replaced those sections the year Daniel turned 12, patiently cutting fresh sod from the meadow and fitting it in place while Daniel held the tools. That memory returned often during those first cold weeks. Samuel had been dead less than 3 months. The cabin still held signs of him everywhere. His pipe rested on the mantel. His wool coat hung on a peg beside the door. A pair of worn leather boots sat by the hearth, the left one slightly larger than the right because of a fall he had taken years earlier. Daniel had not moved any of those things. Some evenings, when the wind moved through the spruce, he half expected to hear the old man step behind him. Samuel Halvorson had come to Minnesota in 1848 from a village east of Bergen, in a country where houses had worn sod roofs for 1,000 years. He had built the cabin himself in 1849, the year before the territory even had proper county lines. Daniel's father had been born under that roof. Daniel himself had spent every summer of his childhood there, running through the clearing while his grandfather cut hay and mended fences. What the neighbors saw as backwardness, Daniel had always known as something else, though he could not yet have explained it clearly. It was not merely tradition. It was not merely stubbornness. It was a way of building that his grandfather had chosen carefully, and Daniel had never known him to choose anything without a reason. He said none of this aloud. He had tried once with Rebecca. The words had come out wrong. He had spoken of his grandfather and she had heard sentimentality. He had spoken of the roof's warmth and she had heard excuses. Somewhere in the middle of the conversation, he had understood that the two of them were not actually arguing about shingles. They were arguing about what kind of life they were meant to lead. And on that question, the distance between them had turned out to be greater than either of them had realized. By early November, Daniel had stopped explaining himself to anyone. He simply worked, and the cabin, low and quiet under its living roof, worked with him. The first snows came late that year. Old-timers along the ridge noticed it and remarked on it, though most of the newer families paid little attention. The lake below the settlement had not yet frozen at its center when the calendar turned to December, and the deer still moved through the low country as though the season had forgotten its own rules. Daniel noticed too. He had grown up watching his grandfather read the woods the way other men read newspapers, and something about the late warmth troubled him without giving him a reason he could put into words. He put the feeling to work. He doubled the size of his firewood stack against the north wall of the cabin, splitting hardwood until the pile ran nearly to the eaves. He carried 3 barrels of drinking water into the root cellar and covered them with sacking. He salted a haunch of venison and hung it from the rafters. He checked the barn where his 2 draft horses and a milk cow stood against the coming cold, and he repacked the seams of the door with fresh oakum. None of this was unusual work for a homesteader. What was unusual was how much of it he did and how quickly. Peter Gunderson noticed. Riding past on the 12th of December, he called out from the road, "Stocking up like a bear, Daniel, expecting company." Daniel raised a hand in greeting and did not answer. Peter laughed and rode on. His own house, a fine 2-story frame with dormer windows and a wraparound porch, stood 4 miles east on a rise that caught the sun. He had built it the previous summer and was proud of the way the shingles caught the light. His wife had ordered curtains from a catalog in Minneapolis. Their eldest daughter played a mail-order piano in the front parlor. It was, by every measure the county recognized, a proper house. Rebecca had, in fact, stayed in that house twice during the autumn. Peter's wife and Mrs. Lund were second cousins, and there had been talk of Rebecca spending part of the winter there rather than at her own family's home in town. Daniel heard about it the way he heard about most things now, second-hand, from a neighbor's boy who came by to trade eggs. He said nothing. He carried the eggs inside, set them on the counter, and went back to splitting wood. The old ledger came to him almost by accident. It happened on the evening of the 15th of December. He had been searching a drawer for a spool of copper wire when his hand closed instead around a small leather-bound book he had never seen before. The cover was cracked and stained with what looked like tallow. The pages were filled with his grandfather's careful, slanted hand. Daniel sat down at the table and opened it, expecting an account book, perhaps records of grain sold or cattle traded. What he found instead surprised him. It was a private ledger, half accounts and half something closer to a diary, and the earliest entries dated to 1846, 2 years before Samuel had ever set foot in Minnesota. Daniel read only a few pages that night. The lamplight was poor and his eyes were tired. He set the book aside on the mantel, meaning to return to it in the morning. Outside, the wind had shifted to the north and taken on a new sound, thinner and more urgent than it had been at sundown. He did not know it yet, but by dawn the sky would have changed entirely. Daniel woke before dawn to a sound he did not immediately recognize. It was not the ordinary creak of a cabin settling in the cold, nor the familiar hush of a heavy snowfall. It was something deeper, a low pressure against the walls, as though the whole clearing had drawn a breath and refused to release it. He rose in the dark, stirred the banked coals in the hearth, and added 2 dry lengths of oak. The fire caught quickly. He watched the flame for a moment before crossing to the small window beside the door. Outside, there was nothing to see. The world had gone white. Not the ordinary white of a Minnesota morning, but a wall of driven snow moving sideways across the clearing at a speed he had never witnessed before. He could not make out the edge of the barn 20 paces away. He could not see the spruce line. He could not even see the woodpile against the north wall. What he could see, when a gust briefly thinned the curtain, was that the snow was not falling from the sky. It was traveling along the ground and above it in a single continuous rush, as though the whole atmosphere had been tipped on its side. He pulled on his coat and stepped out only far enough to check the temperature gauge his grandfather had nailed to the porch post years earlier. The mercury had fallen so low that he had to lean close to read it. 28 below zero, and dropping. The wind, he estimated later, was already blowing at 60 miles an hour. He forced the door closed against it and slid the inner bar into place. Inside, the cabin held steady. The single main room was warm, warmer than the morning cold outside had any right to allow. Daniel added another length of wood to the hearth, more from habit than necessity, and stood for a moment listening. The storm was loud, but the sound of it arrived at the cabin as though from a great distance, dulled and softened by the earth and turf overhead. There was no rattle of shingles because there were no shingles. There was no whistling through the eaves because the eaves were sealed with living root. What there was instead was a deep and steady quiet under the roar, the kind of quiet that suggests something solid between a person and the weather. Daniel checked his supplies methodically. Firewood inside, enough for 4 days if he was careful. Water in 2 covered pails on the hearth. Salt pork, dried beans, a sack of oats, a wheel of cheese wrapped in muslin. Lantern oil for perhaps a week. He set a pot of coffee at the edge of the coals and sat down at the table to think. His mind moved almost involuntarily to the neighbors. Peter Gunderson's fine frame house sat exposed on its rise, catching every wind from the north. The Lund place in town was better sheltered, but Rebecca had been staying with the Gundersons off and on. He did not know where she was this morning. He tried not to know. He tried to keep the thought at arm's length while he drank his coffee and waited for daylight to arrive if it was going to arrive at all. The old ledger still lay on the mantel where he had left it the night before. Daniel glanced at it once, then reached for it. Whatever the day was going to bring, he had time to read now. More time, perhaps, than he wanted. He turned back to the earliest entries first, the ones from 1846. His grandfather's hand had been younger then, the letters firmer and less slanted, but the voice on the page was already recognizable. Samuel had written in a mixture of English and Norwegian, switching between the two the way a man switches tools depending on what he needed to shape. Daniel read slowly, translating in his head where he could. The entries from that first year described a settlement in eastern Kansas, along the Neosho River, where Samuel had lived with his first wife, a woman named Ingrid. Daniel had never heard her name before. He read on. The entries were mostly practical at first, a record of corn planted, chickens bought, a wagon wheel repaired. Then, in early January of 1847, the handwriting changed. It grew smaller and more crowded, as though the writer had needed to keep his hand moving simply to keep his thoughts contained. Daniel read the entry twice before he understood what he was reading. Samuel had built their first house of clapboard, milled at a lumber camp 40 miles to the north. He had been proud of it. It had glass windows shipped from St. Louis and a shingled roof laid in the American style. Ingrid had loved it, Samuel wrote, because it looked like the houses she had seen in pictures from the eastern cities. They had been married 11 months when the blizzard came out of the plains without warning on the 4th of January, 1847. The storm had lasted 3 days. The clapboard house had lost its roof on the second night. Ingrid had died of exposure in the root cellar before the sky cleared on the fourth morning. She had been 22 years old. Daniel set the ledger down and stared at the fire for a long time. Outside, the wind rose to a new pitch, a sustained scream that seemed to reach through the walls and press against his chest. He could hear beneath it the deeper thrum of something enormous moving across the clearing. He picked up the ledger again. Samuel had written the next entry 6 months later, in June of 1847, from a boarding house in St. Louis. He had left Kansas within a week of burying Ingrid. The clapboard house he had built with his own hands had killed her, he wrote, because he had not known any better. He had built the house the way the Americans built houses. He had not built it the way his father and grandfather had built houses in Norway. His father, Samuel wrote, had lived under a sod roof for 71 years in a valley where the wind came off the sea at 100 miles an hour every winter, and no roof his father had ever built had lifted, not once. The last line of that entry was underlined twice. Daniel read it aloud in the empty cabin. "I will not make that mistake again." He closed the ledger gently and set it on the table. The wind outside seemed suddenly quieter, though it had not actually changed. What had changed was the size of the silence inside him. He understood now, in a way he had not understood the night before, why the roof over his head was made of turf and moss and living root. It was not stubbornness. It was not tradition. It was a promise a man had made to a woman he had buried 40 years ago and 1,000 miles south, and had kept every day since. Daniel stood up slowly and walked to the window. The world was still white, but the cabin was warm. The storm did not lift on the second day. It did not lift on the third. Daniel measured its progress the only way he could, by the small brass thermometer his grandfather had mounted on the interior wall opposite the hearth. On the morning of the second day, with the wind still driving snow horizontally past the window, the thermometer read 49 degrees. He fed the fire once every 3 hours. He ate slowly and drank sparingly. He read more of the ledger. On the third morning, he opened the door only far enough to push out the accumulated ash from the hearth and to fetch an armful of firewood from the pile. The wood pile itself had disappeared beneath a drift that reached nearly to the eaves. He had to dig for the logs with his gloved hands, working blind against the wind. What struck him, kneeling there in the snow with his back to the storm, was the shape of his own cabin from the outside. It no longer looked like a building. The sod roof, already blanketed under 16 inches of turf and moss, had accumulated another 2 feet of packed snow. The whole structure had merged with the drift. From 20 paces away, it would have been nearly invisible. From the air, it would have looked like a low ridge of white ground, indistinguishable from the pasture beyond. He returned inside with the wood, barred the door, and stood for a long moment with his palm pressed against the pine of the wall. The wood was warm, not hot, not heated, simply warm, the way a stone that has sat in a sunlit window all afternoon is warm. The heat from the hearth was not escaping. It was staying in the room, held there by a roof built out of the very earth the cabin stood on. He read the ledger more slowly now, savoring the pages. His grandfather had moved north after Ingrid's death, first to Iowa, then to Wisconsin, then finally to Minnesota. In each place he had built with sod or with turf. He had married again in 1852, a Norwegian widow named Marta who had become the grandmother Daniel remembered. Marta had lived under Samuel's sod roof for 31 winters. She had died peacefully in her bed at the age of 64 in the very room where Daniel now sat. The ledger contained a passage from the winter Marta died. Samuel had written it in Norwegian, and Daniel had to work through the words slowly, mouthing them as he went. "She said to me last night that the sod above us is like a grandmother's hand. It does not move quickly and it does not shout, but it does not let go." Daniel read the passage 3 times. On the afternoon of the third day, he thought he heard something over the wind. He listened for several minutes, uncertain. It might have been nothing. It might have been the storm playing tricks. but he had lived long enough in country like this to know that a man who dismissed a sound in a blizzard sometimes woke to find a frozen neighbor at his door. He rose, pulled on his coat, wrapped a scarf across his face, and stepped outside into the roar. The cold struck him like a hammer. He could see nothing. He listened. The sound did not come again. After several minutes, he retreated inside, shivering. He told himself it had been the wind, but he left the outer bar off the door, just in case. That night he slept lightly, and on the fourth day the sound came again, and this time it was real. It was a knock. Not the sharp report of a man's fist, but something softer and more uneven, as though whoever stood outside no longer had the strength to strike the door properly. Daniel heard it once, then a second time, then a long pause. He was across the room before he had thought about moving. He lifted the bar and pulled the door open against the wind, and the storm rushed in with a violence that nearly drove him backward. Two figures stood on the threshold. The taller one held the smaller one against her chest with both arms. Snow had frozen into the wool of her coat until she looked more like a drift than a person. Her scarf had come loose. Her hair was a matted tangle of ice. Her eyes, when they found his, were the only part of her he immediately recognized. Rebecca. He pulled her inside without speaking. The child in her arms, her younger brother Anders, was perhaps 9 years old, and he was not moving. Daniel forced the door closed and slid the bar back into place. Then he took the boy from her, laid him on the pine floor before the hearth, and began the work he had learned as a child, when a man in his grandfather's employ had come in from a whiteout half dead. He stripped the boy's frozen outer coat away carefully, watching for the telltale white patches of true frostbite on the cheeks and fingers. There were some, not many, not yet the deep, waxy kind that could not be reversed. Rebecca stood behind him, shaking so violently she could barely stay upright. She had not spoken. Daniel guided her to the hearthside without letting go of the boy, sat her down on the rag rug his grandmother had woven 40 years earlier, and pressed a folded wool blanket around her shoulders. He poured coffee from the pot at the edge of the coals into a tin cup and set it in her hands. Her fingers would not close around it. He wrapped his own hands around hers and held them there until they did. The boy stirred. He made a small sound in his throat. Daniel worked warmth back into the small hands slowly, chafing them between his own, then wrapping them in flannel. The color returned to Anders's cheeks in patches, the way a fire catches in damp kindling. After perhaps 20 minutes, the boy opened his eyes. He looked at Daniel without recognition, then looked past him at the ceiling, and then closed his eyes again and slept. Only then did Daniel turn to Rebecca. She was watching him. Her lips were cracked. There was ice still melting in her eyebrows. She tried to speak and could not. He shook his head to stop her from trying. He poured her a second cup of coffee, made her drink it in small sips, and then a third. He warmed a pan of broth from a jar in the cellar and fed it to her by the spoonful. Somewhere in the middle of it she began to cry without sound, tears freezing on her cheeks before she could wipe them away. The house, she managed finally. The Gunderson house. The roof went. The second night. Daniel nodded slowly. He had suspected as much. Peter, he asked. Cellar, the others too. I don't know if she stopped. She could not finish. How far did you walk? She looked at him. I don't know, she said. I don't know any more. He did not ask again. He set another log on the fire. She slept for nearly 14 hours. Anders slept longer. Daniel kept the fire steady through the night and watched them both in the flickering light, checking now and then that their breathing was even, that no fingers or toes had gone the wrong shade of white. The wind outside continued its work against the roof and walls, but the roof and walls did not answer it. The cabin held at 51 degrees. The thermometer had not dropped below 48 since the storm began. When Rebecca woke, it was late in the morning of the 5th day. The wind had finally begun to lessen. She sat up slowly on the rug, pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders, and looked at the room as though she were seeing it for the first time. Perhaps she was. She had visited the cabin only twice during their engagement, and both times she had spent most of the visit outside, avoiding it. Daniel was at the table, mending a strap for one of the horses. He did not look up immediately. He wanted to give her the space to gather herself. When he did finally raise his eyes, He saw that she was watching him and that she had been watching him for some time. "Daniel," she said. He set the strap down. "I need to say it now," she said, "before I lose the courage." He waited. "I was wrong about the roof, about all of it, about you." Her voice was very small. "Peter said it was a peasant's roof. My father said the same. I let them decide for me. I gave you back the ring because I was ashamed of a house I did not understand." She looked toward the hearth where her brother was still curled asleep in a nest of blankets. "That boy would be dead. I would be dead. Both of us. We walked 4 miles yesterday. I passed 3 houses on the way, the Anderson place, the Voss place, the Bergstrom place, all of them." She stopped again. "All of them are gone, Daniel. The roofs are gone. I looked in the windows. I could not stop to help. I could not carry Anders and stop." Daniel was quiet for a long moment. "You don't need to apologize," he said finally. "Yes," she said. "I do. Not because you require it, because I do." He nodded slowly. He did not know what else to say. He had spent 2 months believing this conversation would never happen and another 3 days believing she might be dead. Now she was on the rug in front of his hearth, and the words she had spoken were the words he had wanted, and he found that having them did not feel the way he had imagined it would feel. It felt smaller and more solemn and more permanent. "There is a ledger," he said after a while. He rose and fetched it from the mantel. He brought it to her and opened it to the page he had marked with a strip of leather. "This was my grandfather's. He kept it from the year he came to this country. There is something in it you should read, not now, when you are stronger, but soon." She took the book carefully, as though it were made of ash and might crumble in her hands. She looked at the writing, at the 2 languages tangled on the page. "Whose is Ingrid?" she asked. "His first wife," Daniel said. "She died in a house he built with shingles." Rebecca closed the ledger and held it against her chest. The storm broke fully on the 6th day. The wind slackened first, then died to a whisper, and then died altogether. The silence that followed was the kind that only comes after a great blizzard, a silence so complete that the settling of a coal in the hearth sounded like a rifle shot. Daniel went out at midday to survey what the storm had left behind. He took his grandfather's snowshoes down from the peg beside the door and strapped them on for the first time in years. The world outside was unrecognizable. Drift stood 12 and 15 feet high in the clearing. The barn was buried nearly to the roof line, though the roof itself, low and stoutly framed, had held. He dug down to the door and found both horses and the cow alive, thin and thirsty but sound. He carried water in a copper kettle from the cabin's hearth and thawed the trough enough to give them a drink. He forked hay from the loft. He spoke to them softly, the way his grandfather had always spoken to animals, and they leaned their heads against him one at a time. Then he walked the road. It took him most of the afternoon to cover the 4 miles to Peter Gunderson's place. He walked slowly, his eyes moving from drift to drift, watching for shapes that should not be there. Twice he saw something dark against the snow and had to dig to be sure. Both times it was a fence post. Once it was not. He found Peter Gunderson's fine 2-story frame house exactly as Rebecca had described it. The roof was simply gone, torn away in sections, the raw ends of the rafters standing up against the sky like the ribs of a beached whale. The upper story had collapsed into the lower. The front parlor, where the mail-order piano had stood, was open to the weather. Daniel called out. No one answered. He worked his way around to the root cellar door at the rear of the house, dug it clear, and pulled it open. Peter Gunderson was there, and his wife and their 2 daughters, and a neighbor Daniel did not know by name. All 4 Gundersons were alive. Cold, half-starved, one of the daughters with badly frost-bitten feet. The neighbor was not alive. He had come in from his own ruined house on the 2nd night and had not survived the 3rd. Daniel brought them to his cabin one at a time on a sled he cobbled from barn boards. It took him 2 days. By the time he had them all inside, the small main room was crowded past what it had ever been meant to hold. But it was warm, and it stayed warm. Peter Gunderson, a proud man who had never in his life apologized to anyone, sat on the floor beside the hearth with his youngest daughter in his lap and said, without looking at Daniel, "I was a fool." Daniel poured him coffee and said nothing. Over the next week, others came. A few had survived in their own root cellars. A few had walked in from ruined homes the way Rebecca had. Word traveled fast now that the wind had stopped. Daniel's cabin, the sod cabin the whole valley had mocked, became the place people went. He fed them from his stores. He gave them his bed and slept on the floor. Rebecca worked beside him, and so did her brother when he was strong enough, and by the end of the second week the room felt less like a shelter and more like something older. A hearth, a gathering place, a house. The county eventually counted its dead. 19 souls lost in the ridge country north of Duluth alone, more than 60 across the region. Every one of them had lived beneath a shingled roof. The newspapers in St. Paul called it the Great Blizzard of 1888, and for a generation afterward, old men on the ridge would date events by whether they had happened before or after the storm. Children born that spring were said to belong to the aftertime. Daniel Halvorson was one of the men who helped bury the dead as the ground thawed. He dug graves for people who had laughed at his roof. He said nothing about it as he worked. Neither did anyone else. Rebecca stayed. The Lund house in town had come through with only minor damage. The streets of Larson's Crossing had sheltered it from the worst of the wind. But her parents came out to the cabin in early March, and her father, a man who had once called Daniel's home a peasant's hovel, sat at the pine table and asked Daniel if he might teach him how a sod roof was built. Daniel said he would. They were married in June, in the little Lutheran church whose congregation had once made a joke of him. No one made jokes anymore. That spring, Daniel began the second cabin. He cut the logs from his own spruce line and squared them the way his grandfather had taught him. He built it 100 yards from the first, in a clearing that caught the morning sun. It was meant for Rebecca's parents and Anders, so that they might live nearby if they chose. When it came time to close the roof, Daniel cut sod from the meadow with a horse-drawn plow, and he laid it 16 inches thick over sheets of fresh birch bark, and he let the grass roots grow into a living mat that would hold for 100 years if anyone let it. Peter Gunderson came to help. So did 3 other men who had once offered to tear the first roof off. They did not speak of that offer. They worked in silence and drank coffee at midday from tin cups Rebecca brought out on a wooden tray. The old ledger stayed on the mantel in the first cabin. Rebecca read it in full that summer, sitting in the doorway in the long northern evenings, and when she reached the entry about Ingrid, she closed the book and sat quietly for a long time before she opened it again. She kept adding to it after that. New entries in her own hand, alongside Samuel's old ones. The birth of their first child in the spring of 1890. The birth of their second in 1892. The winter Anders left for the university at St. Paul, the first in the family to go. A record of firewood cut, of grain sold, of the small daily accountings by which a life is measured on the frontier. Years later, when Daniel was an old man himself, a young reporter from a Minneapolis paper came out to the ridge to write a piece on the last of the old sod-roof cabins. He asked Daniel why he had kept the roof all those years, when everyone else had long since moved to shingles and tin. Daniel thought about the question for a while. He looked up at the low, grassy line of his own roof, where a patch of clover was blooming near the ridge, and he answered the way his grandfather might have answered. "Because it kept its promise," he said, "and I keep mine."